Hello.
Hello. Hello.
It's a beautiful day in Bangor. How is it in San Antonio?
Maybe. In Dallas, it's hot.
You're in Dallas. You're not in San Antonio.
Okay.
How are things in Dallas?
It's 90 degrees. The sun is shining.
It's a rainy, humid, kind of gross day here.
Oh, wow. Yes, we wish it will rain here. Hello.
Hi, Terry.
Hello.
Hello, Will.
So we'll go ahead and I will start. This is a class that I've been meaning to do for a while, but one of my students from the introductory class, I won't embarrass him or her by pointing him or her out, but they came to me with a question. They said well, I was reading in this Tanakh you had us by, this blue book. I was reading the book of Deuteronomy because this is the parsha that we're in. And it doesn't talk about the Torah being received at Mount Sinai. It talks about the Torah being received at Horeb, seemingly a different mountain. And this is what's up with that? Why would the name of the mountain be different in one book than it is in another book? And this is part of the answer to that. This is part of the answer to that. But the story of the book of Devarim, the story of why it's different than the other books, is something that has fascinated, illuminated, and even today it's a topic of scholarly inquiry and question. So this course that we're going to do, and I'll start the old PowerPoint up in a minute, is the Enigma. The Enigma of the book of Deuteronomy. And I always like to start with a little bit of a story. So the story that we're going to do, I mean, of course, the book of Deuteronomy is perhaps 2,500, 3,000 years old. But the story for tonight's going to begin a little later than that, in the year 1492. This is a picture this was a painting that was made in the 17th century, showing the Jews of Spain begging Ferdinand and Isabel to permit Jews to live as Jews in Spain. The proposal was that Jews would have to convert or leave, and we know that ultimately was the decision. Between the monarchs and the Jews is, of course, Torquemada, the great inquisitor, and the character in the yellow robe with the sheaf of papers in his hand is a commentator, a philosopher, and a statesman. He was actually the main financier. He was the minister of finance for the queen, a man named Don Yitzhak Abarbanel. And he was the representative of the Jews. He's here pleading with the monarchs in vain that they would be permitted to live in Spain as Jews. And he would lose this argument, and he would make the same plea in Portugal over the next decade, and he would lose there. Along the way, it's rumored, the conjecture is that he was among the financiers of Christopher Columbus, in his journey to the New World. But on his way out of Spain, he wrote he wrote a huge commentary on the Torah and the other books of the Hebrew Bible. And the first question that he asks, the first question that he deals with, he says this was the inspiration as he's growing old in Naples. What started me on the journey of being a commentator was the question is, what is the status? What is the status of the book of Deuteronomy? Just some other articles on Don Yitzhak Abravano. There's a tremendous biography, if you're interested in learning more, Don Yitzhak Abravano, statesman and philosopher, written by the former prime minister's father, Ben-Zion Netanyahu. It's an incredible book by an incredible scholar. But the thing that Don Abravano realized was that, on Sesame Street, we sing the song, one of these things is not like the other ones. One of these things doesn't belong. That in the 5 books of the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy seems to be different than the first 4 books. And we're going to talk about why people see it, why is it different, what are the differences, and what's the meaning of those differences? How do we understand the fact that the book of Deuteronomy seems to be very different than the other books? Abravano was a very systematic thinker. If you read his commentary, he starts every parsha with the same thing. These are the questions I'm going to explore. These are the doubts that I have, the problems I have with the parsha. And so he begins this look into Deuteronomy, says, these are the doubts I have that Deuteronomy can be attributed to the dictation of God as we understand the rest of the Torah to be. And so there's 3 doubts that Abravano brings forward. The first doubt that he says is, well, the book of Deuteronomy repeats a lot of things that we have already gone over in the Torah. If you were in synagogue 2 weeks ago, we read the 10 Commandments from the book of Deuteronomy. And of course, this is the second time we read it because the 10 Commandments appears in the book of Exodus as well. The name of the mountain is different. In the book of Exodus, the name of the mountain is Mount Sinai. And in the Deuteronomy, it's Horeb. Sinai means moon and Horeb means sun. So they mean like the opposite things as well. It's kind of tantalizing. But why do we need if the entire Torah was the dictation of God, why would he do the 10 Commandments twice? That's a strange way for a deity to go about writing a book. The second doubt that Abravano has, and this is something that anyone who's read the books realize, is that in the first 4 books, Moses is referred to in the 3rd person. What do we say over and over again? And the Lord spoke to Moses saying, that doesn't appear at all in the book of Deuteronomy. In the book of Deuteronomy, Moses is in the first person. I did this. And I, Moses, beseech you to do that, which is really kind of striking. I mean, probably the most famous part of the synagogue service is the Shema, and that's written in the book of Deuteronomy. And it's kind of weird that the most central prayer that we have is not the part of the Torah that was written by God, but the part of the Torah that seems to come from Moses in the first person. But Shema Yisrael, this is Moses composing a charge to the children of Israel. And so this was his second doubt. And the third doubt is really very tantalizing and very, very strange for people who hear about it for the first time. The rabbinic literature itself, the Talmud, the Mishnah, the literature we ascribe to the rabbis, it seems to indicate in its terms that parts of Deuteronomy are the words only of Moses and not the words of God. We have one example in Tractate Megillah, the curses. When you come to synagogue on the wrong Shabbat, the curses are very long sections of, curses, things that will go poorly, things that will go bad if we don't follow God's law. There's one at the end of Leviticus, and there's one at the end of Deuteronomy. And when you come in for the curses, you know it's the curses because it's long, and the reader is reading the Torah in an undertone because we don't want to sound happy and stuff when we read the curses. But the curses, according to the Talmud, are of different character. The curses in the book of Leviticus and the curses in the book of Deuteronomy. The Talmud is talking about when you can divide up little bits of the Torah to be read. There are parts of the Torah you can't break up, that you have to read all at once. And there are parts of the Torah people can take turns reading, the same way we take turns reading on every Shabbat, or we used to take turns reading before COVID. It turns out these days that that I'm doing most of the reading, which is fine. I like to read. I look forward to hearing other people read again someday. But the curses in the book of Leviticus, we are not allowed to divide up according to the Talmud. Only one person can read them, and it has to be read in a single aliyah. But the curses in Devarim, you're allowed to break up. You can have more than one reader do them, though I've never done them. And the question is, why would that be the case? Why would we treat one section of curses differently than the others? And the Talmud gives us this strange answer. The curses in Leviticus are stated in the plural, and Moses pronounced them from the mouth of the Almighty. As such, they are more severe. However, the curses in Deuteronomy are stated in the singular, and Moses said them on his own. This is according to the Talmud, that there is a section of the Torah, the curses at least, in Deuteronomy that are not composed by God, but are words that Moses arranged and Moses put together. And even the entire book of Deuteronomy could be considered to be written by Moses, according to some interpretations of sections in the Talmud. We have a very intriguing little passage of Talmud in Talmud Bava Batra, where it lists all of the rabbis' theories of who wrote which book in the Torah. So which books did Moses write? It says, well, Moses wrote his own book. He wrote the portion of Bilam and the book of Job. I mean, all of these are kind of interesting. I mean, who before you read this, whoever thought that Moses was the author of Job? And why would we single out the portion of Bilam as opposed to the rest of the Torah for Moses to be the author of? But what does it mean when it says Moses wrote his own book? And many people who have commentated on this say when it says that Moses wrote his own book, it's referring to the book of Deuteronomy, the fifth book of the Torah, that this is a Mosaic composition. It's his own words, his own arrangement. And in this way, it's different than the other four books that we read before. And this is simply amazing. This is simply amazing. Indeed, after Abravano does his doubts, the reasons that we doubt that the entire Torah was dictated by God, he does his reassurances. I mean, this is evidence that Abravano is going to have to say that why Deuteronomy must be of the same divine origin as the rest of the Torah. The first one is that it simply has to be true. When you consider the way that we act, we lift up all of the books. We lift up the entire scroll when we finish reading, and we say, "V'zot Torah asher sam Moshe lifnei bnei Yisrael al pi Adonai b'yad Moshe." That this is the Torah that Moses put before us. We don't say that like 1/5 of it or 4/5 of it. We treat the Torah as a unitary composition, and we honor the entire Torah as sacred. We don't, and there are things that the rabbis do treat Deuteronomy differently, but in our practice, in our lives, we don't treat the book of Deuteronomy as any less sacred than the 4 books that come before it. So it is just simply impossible at some level to imagine that the book of Deuteronomy could be different than the 4 books that were before it. Abravano has some other reassurances. There are passages in Deuteronomy that do refer to Moses in the 3rd person, particularly towards the end of the book. Deuteronomy does, from time to time, include new laws. And also, we had evidence from the rabbinic literature that said that Deuteronomy is different. We also have evidence from the rabbinic literature that says that it is the same. The rabbis say in Tractate Sanhedrin, there's a conversation about who gets a portion of the world to come and who doesn't. And one category of people, according to the rabbis, that have no portion in the world to come is anyone that says that the Torah is not from heaven. That if you make a statement that says the Torah is not a divine origin, you lose your right in the world to come. It makes no distinction between the first 4 books and the 5th book. And so at the end of the day, Abravano says, well, I had my doubts. I have my reassurances. He very famously asked another scholar of his time to say, well, what do I do with this? And the answer that he was given and the answer that Abravano gives to us is that it indeed, there are parts of the Torah that happened and were not given to be written as they happened. And we know that this is true of everything in like Genesis up until the time that Moses was born. By definition, Moses could not have been a witness to the things that happened before he lived. But before Moses died, God dictated them to him and he was able to write them down. The same thing you can say about the end of the book, that Moses did make those speeches, but that was not the moment when Deuteronomy was composed. Deuteronomy was composed with the entire Torah at the end of Moses' life, where God dictated to him all of these things that happened at different times. They happened at different times, and that's reflected in the fact that the Torah is from a different point of view at different times. But at the act of dictation, the act of revelation, the act when the Torah was composed was a single moment where God dictated things to Moses, even the speeches that Moses had gave himself in the book of Deuteronomy. And so that's kind of when Abravano leaves it. He goes on to do his commentary. And this is really where the state of the understanding is, I think, as we leave the Middle Ages and we go on to modernity. I'm going to tell my second story, which is how the moderns approach the book of Deuteronomy shortly. But before I do, I'll stop in a minute and take any questions. But before I take questions, I just want to point out that the differences between what we call Deuteronomy and the other 4 books, in modern scholarships, we refer to Deuteronomy as D, and we refer to the first 4 books as P, the priestly tradition. And we do have the question, there are different names, there are Sinai versus Korev, but there are differences in legal and ritual practices. When we read the book of Exodus, it's clear that the offering for Passover is a sheep. When we read the book of Deuteronomy, it could be a sheep, but it could also be a cow. It doesn't have to be a sheep, it just has to be an animal. It's a very different way of looking at the holiday because Exodus spends a lot of time on the sheep angle. But the theology, not just the superficial, not just the structure, not just the surface of the books are different, but they seem to deal with different theological categories and different outlooks on the world. And I've just tried to summarize some of it. Deuteronomy focuses on the individual as an abstract legal entity. It's concerned with the interactions that we have with each other that have legal relevance. So the word used in Deuteronomy is always ish or isha. It's an abstract way of looking at a person. The priestly tradition, the first 4 books, focuses on the individual as a flesh and blood creature, that it's concerned with the consequences of being a temporal creature in a temporal world, subject to generation and corruption, but then ultimately facing a God that is transcendent. And how do we do that? It's not necessarily interested in much in legal matters and abstract matters. And the way of looking at how we deal with people that aren't doing what we want them to do is also fundamentally different between Deuteronomy and the first 4 books. That the language of Deuteronomy is the language of tzaddikim and reshaim, of the righteous and the evildoers, as George Bush the 43rd would say, evildoers. You have people that are good and people that are bad, and society has to come to terms with what do we do with the bad people, and how do we reward the good people. The priestly tradition, well, yes, the priestly tradition also has the categories of good and bad, but the fundamental prism by which the priestly tradition looks at people is the category of sinners. And it's a category that includes everyone. And the focus then is not on meting out the appropriate punishment for people that we feel are wrong or people that we feel are evil. But the emphasis is how the individual corrects him or herself and brings one back into the communion, into the communion with God, and back into the rhythms of society. They are really the point of this is that the differences between the traditions are not the superficial matters of the presentation, the way that the literature is formed, but they seem to have strongly different worldviews. And we can talk more about that. The next phase, I'm going to talk about the modern journey of the things that Abravano began to explore. But I will, this is kind of the halfway point of the presentation. So I'll take a little break here. I will stop the share and I'll take everyone's temperature and see if there are any questions or any comments on this, story.
Hey, so when reading this, when you read Deuteronomy, is there anything that you feel that should be really paid attention to as far as something that is new, different, or more important, less important than, previous books? Or, is there some way to look at this in a lens that, oh, well, this particular portion of it is extremely, different or important or etc. So that's my question.
Yeah, the focus of Deuteronomy is the charge that Moses brings. William Safire called Deuteronomy the greatest speech that anyone had ever given. And since Safire worked for Richard Nixon, I mean, he would know about all of the speeches. It really, I mean, it is the one book in the Torah which is trying to persuade. It's the one book in the Torah that's trying to convince. Leviticus in the priestly tradition is saying, well, this is the way it is. And yeah, you can jump on or not jump on. And if you don't jump on, there'll be some consequences. But I don't care that much about whether you jump on or not. Deuteronomy is the moment where Moses tries to seal the deal. So it's the one part of the Torah where we focus on the necessity of persuasion and of urging people to do the correct thing, that it's not simply our job, that it's not simply our job to order our own souls. It's not simply our job to take care of our own ethics or our own conscience, but there's a mission in society of persuading others to do the things that are going to be good for them and good for the world. And so sort of mentally, when I make the move into Deuteronomy, I mean, part of what I recognize, and I don't know that everyone recognizes this, the language of Deuteronomy is more flowery. The tropes are more musical. And when we read it, there's a little more song to it than there is in the previous 4 books. But it is the moment where we start to really not be a priest, but to be a prophet. A priest has to take care of the sanctuary. The prophet has to go out and tell people that what they're doing is wrong and they have to change their ways or not. It's a different religious stance. And that's really I think that's the big thing that enters my consciousness as we turn to Deuteronomy from the previous 4 books, the element of persuasion, which hasn't existed so far in the Torah, is suddenly at the center of everything.
Rabbi,
I'm sorry. Sorry.
How do the rabbis explain the difference in the name of the mountain, the location of where the law was given, the 10 Commandments were given? How do they explain that?
This is going to be very disappointing. They explain it by saying they have different names. That's, I mean, there are several characters and several places in the Bible that are called by different names, and there are a list of these things in the Talmud, and it's like, yes, and this is a list of things that have different names, and these are the names. And then they stop. It is so it's really very, I mean, I don't know if that's so interesting, but that is frustrating. What is interesting is that the rabbis do not really care to address the tension between their conceptions of the Torah. That does not seem to bother the rabbis that in one part of the Talmud, it says that it seems to make it very clear that Moses composed at least part of the book of Deuteronomy. And another part of the Talmud, it says anyone who says that has no portion in the world to come. And those things are they're not in tension, they're contradictory. And the rabbis, for some reason, don't really seem to be interested in dealing with that. And that's that's part of the disinterest that the rabbis have, I think, in theology, that for legal matters, if there's a difference between law in one part of the Torah and another part of the Torah, or a different understanding of law in the Talmud. Well, in some place the Talmud says this, in some place it says this. About a legal matter, the rabbis absolutely care to figure out what the law is. They're very interested in practice. They are very disinterested in theology. And I mean, on the one hand, that could be frustrating, but on the other hand, it's fascinating that this debate does not really begin to be engaged until the post-rabbinic era in the Middle Ages, when people start to read these things systematically.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question. I wonder if Moses repeating himself in Deuteronomy was about leaving a lasting impression of what he felt was the most important lessons in the previous book. Yes, I mean, it really does seem to be, I mean, that's a really powerful way of looking at it. I mean, it accepts the conjecture that Moses is the author of Deuteronomy, but it is really, I think, his mission in this book to say, this is my last speech. I mean, at the beginning of the book, it's like the day before he dies. The end of the book is the day he dies. And on the last day that I am alive, I am going to give this speech and tell you what it all means. I'm going to write a song and I'm going to sum everything up. And this is, I mean, if you remember nothing else, remember what I tell you this afternoon, because this is important. I think I think that's precisely how the book invites us to read it. With that, I will turn to the moderns. And for the moderns, we have to bring in our friends, the Germans. This higher criticism, the rabbis set the table for higher criticism in many ways. When Spinoza begins the project of higher criticism in the 15th century, I think that was maybe the 16th century, he who want to have a date for Spinoza?
1732 to 1777.
So that's the 16th century? I always get confused which one you...
It's the 17th century.
The 17th century.
Yeah.
Thank you. So Spinoza, who lived in the 1700s.
When he lived in the 1600s, but it's the 17th century.
1600, yeah, this is... I'm in a steep cognitive decline. But anyway, thank you, Arnold. When Spinoza begins the enterprise of higher criticism, he does so from his roots as somebody who has studied the traditional rabbinic writings. He knew people like Abravano. He knew of rabbinic scholars like Ibn Ezra, who certainly suggested that there were problems with the unitary idea of the Torah being composed either as a unitary work by God or as a unitary work by Moses. But the rabbis that he cited never followed the argument through. And it's Spinoza and the people who follow him who draw the conclusions from the questions that the rabbis asked. Spinoza begins the process and it reaches its flowering at the hands of our friends, the Germans, particularly De Wette and Wellhausen. The idea of the Deuteronomist as a independent work in the Bible, which I'll explain shortly, arises in the 19th century by Wilhelm Martin de Wette. And the assumptions that he brings and that all of the members of higher criticism bring is that higher criticism understands the Hebrew Bible as a compilation of discernible historical strata. It's what we call the documentary hypothesis. The idea that there are documents out there somewhere that people are exploring. But very critically, and it is essential to understand how devastating this appeared to Jews and continues to appear to Jews in many circles, higher criticism inverts the process of, it inverts the priority that Jews give to the Hebrew Bible. For Jews, the most important work is the Torah and the prophets and the writings, these sections of the Bible that we did in the introductory class, that the prophets and the writings are subordinate to that. For the critical theorist, for the higher critics, the Torah is to be read as subordinate to the historical and the prophetic works. We learn how to understand the Torah by placing it in the history of Israel. And the presumption is that the Torah is perhaps the last of the works to be put in their final form. For the traditional Jew, the oldest part of the Hebrew Bible is the Torah, and that everything after that comes later. For the higher critic and for the modern scholar, the earliest books in the Bible, in terms of how we source them, are the wisdom literature and the early prophets, particularly Amos, Hosea, and the northern prophets. So we look to the historical books to understand where the Torah comes from. And there's a story in the second book of Kings that is taken by the modern critics to tell us where Deuteronomy comes from. And this is the story of Josiah, King Josiah in the discovered scroll. And I didn't put the chapter here, but this is 2 Kings chapter 21. And I'll just read this little paragraph of this, of the story that Josiah was 8 years old when he became king. So it would have been about 640 BCE. He reigned 31 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Yedidiah, the daughter of Adaiah of Bozchas. And unlike the other kings, he did what was pleasing to the Lord, and he followed in all the ways of his ancestor David. He did not deviate to the right or to the left. And if you read the book of Kings, they don't say this about just about any other king. The position of the book of Kings is that most of the kings of Judah and Israel were terrible. But Josiah was a good king, according to the author of the book of Kings. In the 18th year of King Josiah, the king sent the scribe Shaphan, the son of Azaliah, the son of Meshullam, to the house of the Lord, saying, "Go to the high priest Hilkiah and let him weigh the silver that has been deposited in the house of the Lord, which guards of the threshold have collected from the people." This was kind of a good governance thing. We're going to have transparency in the way the temple is operated. Later on, the high priest Hilkiah said to the scribe Shaphan, "I have found a scroll of the teaching of the Torah." Yeah, Torah means teaching. "In the house of the Lord." And Hilkiah gave the scroll to Shaphan, who read it. The scribe of Shaphan then went to the king and reported, "Your servants have melted down the silver that was deposited in the house, and they have delivered it to the overseers of the work." But the scribe also told the king, "The high priest Hilkiah has given me a scroll." And Shaphan read the scroll to the king. The king heard the words of the teaching, the words of the Torah. And when he heard the words of the Torah, he rent his clothes. The idea is that he realized that there had been hidden in the temple, in the house of the Lord, a book of teaching that was left there from the times of Moses, that had been ignored, that contained rules of the holidays that were not being followed. And he realized that because of the discovery of this book, the entire nation needed to repent. Well, what was the content of this scroll that was discovered? What was in this scroll? The reforms that Josiah engaged in, the reason that Josiah was a good king, the themes of his reform are suspiciously close to the themes that we find in the book of Deuteronomy. A central piece of the Hoseaan reform was the centralization of worship in Jerusalem. Before Josiah, there were temples, there were bamot all over Judah. And Josiah, he suppressed them, which means he burnt them down and he killed the priests. But indeed, the centralization of worship is a central theme in the book of Deuteronomy. If you come to synagogue this week, when we read Re'eh, at the end of every paragraph, it seems to say, "In the place I will place my name. Only one place will you worship me." Josiah suppressed the fertility cults. Deuteronomy hates the fertility cults. Josiah removed the foreign gods from the temple. The book of Deuteronomy is filled with the abhorrence of idolatry. And Josiah conducted the Holy War. And the Holy War is just sometimes people have the wrong idea about the Holy War because of, I don't know, current events, but people think that the Holy War is when you go off and you die for God. But in the Hebrew Bible, the Holy War is the opposite. In the Holy War of the Hebrew Bible, God goes out and fights for us, and we don't have to fight. And so the idea is that even if you're surrounded by these big empires, you can go out and make war against them, and you'll win because God is on your side. And a major theme of the book of Deuteronomy is the institution of this holy war, which Josiah instituted and fought and was killed almost instantly by the Egyptian army. It didn't go well. But he did what the prophets always wanted them to do, which was to do the holy war. Because the themes of the book of Deuteronomy are so close to the themes of Hoseia's reforms, the proposal is that the scroll that was discovered, the discovery of the scroll that is described in the Book of Kings was the discovery of something like the Book of Deuteronomy. You can either see it very innocently as that the Book of Deuteronomy existed from the time of Moses and had been lost. Most scholars do not look at it as innocently. They see that the Book of Deuteronomy is what you would call a pious fraud, like the donation of Constantine. But by being able to place the story of a book in the Torah within the history of Israel, by showing that how the study of the historical books could highlight the origin of the Torah. This was the beginnings of what we call higher criticism. And this was the first foundation of what we call today the documentary hypothesis, the first turning of the key, as it were, discovering that the Book of Deuteronomy and the other 4 books just don't look differently on the surface, just don't have different theologies, but actually come from different sources. That there is a Deuteronomist tradition, which is in contrast to the priestly tradition that describes the first 4 books, and these are put together somehow. These are put together somehow in the period of the Second Temple into a single work, which disguises or obliterates the history that they have as separate entities. We started with the little Sesame Street number 1 of these things. It's not like the other ones. One of these doesn't belong. And it looks, again, you get the idea that Deuteronomy does not belong to this collection of the Torah. But there is a collection to which it belongs, and this is what scholars describe as the Deuteronomist history. That the 5 books, starting with Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, that these 5 books constitute a history of Israel. That Deuteronomy is the prologue to the story that really begins in Joshua and continues until the end of the Book of Kings, where you have the destruction of the first commonwealth. And so that Deuteronomy really stands in the middle. It's the end of the Torah, and it's different than the other 4 books, but it links the Torah to this larger historical work, which we call the Deuteronomist history. And the speculation about who produces it always goes to the northern prophets, to people like Jeremiah, to Hosea, and Amos. These are seen to be the literary influences. In the case of Jeremiah, is often suspected of being the literal creator of the Book of Deuteronomy, of the entire Deuteronomist history. That this is a work of scholars that lived in Judah, either before the destruction of the temple or immediately after the destruction of the temple, the exile, trying to understand what happened. And because of whatever reason, the beginning of this larger work is included at the end of our Torah. How do we respond to this as Jews? I mean, Jews are very defensive in the face of the documentary hypothesis. Solomon Schechter, Alav HaSholem, called higher criticism higher anti-Semitism. and you can understand the defensiveness, and it isn't so much. I think that people. The idea that the Torah is divided into bits is not the hardest part of the documentary hypothesis for the traditional Jew to come to terms with. It is a problem, but lots of the Torah is in pieces. We've always known that there were contradictions in the Torah, and the Torah always had the hallmarks of a composite document. What makes the documentary hypothesis so difficult is the precedence that it gives to the prophetic and historical works at the expense of the Torah. because that is precisely the emphasis which Christianity places on the Hebrew Bible. But for Christians, the most important book of the Hebrew Bible is Isaiah, or maybe Psalms. And that in the Christian world, the historical books are the most important books, because for the Christians, the Hebrew Bible, the relevance is history. It's done. It's not a living book. For Jews, our emphasis on our emphasis is not on the history, but it's on the picture of the community that we see in the first 5 books. And so the reordering of the precedents, it's devaluing the Torah and giving precedence to the historical books. It has always been very challenging for Jews, as is the sense that nobody likes to have their own work. You don't like to see discoveries in your own work made by people outside of your faith. You're always happier when you can make those discoveries yourselves. And it was not, wasn't a happy occasion that we had to learn this or experience this through non-Jews or through the Germans. So the major response to this as it unfolds in the 19th century, that's to say the 1800s, is resistance. People like the Chaldal, Luzzatto, would write defenses against the documentary hypothesis, attacking it, and this was mostly the procedure for the first half of the 20th century. The Jews would defend themselves against the documentary hypothesis by trying to demonstrate that the documentary hypothesis was incomplete or that it was incorrect, and therefore vindicate the traditional Jewish understanding of the work. I would close, though, with one person who took a very different path in the face of this scholarship. And this is an individual that we have studied before, or the Jewish Plato, they call him, Rabbi Eliyahu ben Mosaic, the sage of Livorno. Ben Mosaic was a great Kabbalist. He was a great halachist. His family was from Morocco, but he grew up and he lived his life in Livorno, Italy. And his family, they were publishers, and they published both Jewish books and non-Jewish books. And when he was a kid, he would be sent by his father to go work in their warehouse. And he used to say, I would steal from my father's time. I would, instead of doing the work I was supposed to do, I would read all of the non-Jewish books that were there, books about Plato, books about humanities, books about the Enlightenment. And he developed, he developed the great perspective as a humanist, that he was somebody who had great facility, not just in Jewish works, but with the great works of non-Jews, and felt that you could integrate those two worlds. His approach to the book of Deuteronomy, I think, is just fascinating, and it sets the table for a productive Jewish encounter, I think, with higher criticism. And unlike his contemporaries who were defensive against the documentary hypothesis, who sought to show that it was wrong, that we could learn nothing from it, Ben Mosaic accepts the rabbinic, medieval, and modern observations about the distinctiveness of Deuteronomy, that it is different. It is different from the other 4 books in a way that prevents us from assuming that there is a unitary authorship of the Torah. But he explains this by expanding the rabbinic understanding of what we call the oral Torah. In the introductory class, we talked about the oral Torah, that we have the written Torah, the Hebrew Bible, and the oral Torah comes to be through the Mishnah and the Talmud. Ben Mosaic says that the oral Torah begins with Deuteronomy, that Moses, and this is in keeping with the view that Moses is the first rabbi, Moses is making a distinctive contribution to the holy Jewish writ by anticipating what is going to happen through the ages, that just as the rabbis were going to be expanding the law, testing the law, putting their own mark on the law, Moses himself was making the transition from a written Torah that was divine writ to the oral Torah, which was the Torah of the rabbis, which is the Torah that is taught, which is the Torah that is created. When an individual reads the words of the written Torah, assimilates them, and teaches them in his own voice. That because we close the Torah with a chapter, with the book of Moses in his own voice, we learn the requirement from there. And the requirement that Jews have followed through the ages, that we always have to put the teachings that we learn from our parents and our teachers into our own words. Because according to Ben Mosaic, and he says, this is what the scholarship said, Deuteronomy is different. And this was Moses doing what we're supposed to do, which is to take the teaching from Sinai and to refract it through ourselves, through our understanding, through our judgment, and then to pass it on to the people after us. The tradition believed that that's what the Mishnah and the Talmud were about. Ben Mosaic says we can take the findings of modern scholarship and understand that that process begins in the written Torah itself. It begins in the book of Deuteronomy. It is distinctive, it is different, but it's critical for understanding what the future responsibilities of Jews are going to be, which is to learn as much Torah as we can and to pass it on to others in our own words, with our own emphasis, with our own ideas. And this is my take on the enigma of Deuteronomy, that we're fascinated by the differences, and we recognize that the differences between Deuteronomy and the other four books have been very fruitful to our understanding of how the Hebrew Bible comes together, even though we get this both from our rabbis, we also get this from the outside scholars. But it's also an opportunity to think about what the point of Torah is. And then when we sit in synagogue and we listen to the book of Deuteronomy, we listen to understand that we're listening to Moses's take on what the divine intention was. We recognize that it was just not Moses' responsibility to do this, it's our responsibility to do this. And I think that's a wonderful, I think that that's a beautiful view of the book of Deuteronomy and what it brings to us.
That's a lovely conclusion. Thank you.
Yeah, this is very interesting. I wanted to. I was thinking of some things that came to mind. My bar mitzvah portion comes from the book of Deuteronomy, the parsha of Ki Tetzeh, and Ki Tetzeh is an interesting parsha because it has the most number of mitzvot in a single parsha of any others, including the ones on the Holy War, for example, that you were speaking about, when you go out on to fight a war against your enemies. But it has other things, like when you find a bird in a nest, and et cetera, et cetera. But what I was fascinating in this last part you mentioned, Rabbi, is Moses maybe starting an oral tradition of maybe rephrasing or adding mitzvot, just like the rabbis later on will add a few that we bless as mitzvot, like lighting the candles on Shabbat or Hanukkah, etc. But what's interesting is that Deuteronomy still has some long sections of mitzvot similar to what you would find in Leviticus. So in that case, it has some similarities, which then is a big contrast to the rest of the books that were labeled in scholarship as part of the Deuteronomy history, because you don't have long lists of mitzvot, but they go more into history. So it's almost like maybe Moses started that, and then it wasn't until a couple thousand years later with the rabbis that then they take that mantle and continue maybe more of that oral tradition. But in the middle, we just have a lot of history and fightings and kings and certainly many prophets that come and admonish the people in the way that Moses does as well in Deuteronomy, for sure, but not necessarily to give them new laws in the same vein.
In your bar mitzvah address, did you urge people to practice the holy war?
Yes, that's right.
Thank you, Rabbi Barone. Other comments or observations?
I have a question. In other things I've read, they talk about at least 4 different people have said that they're all different authors of the Torah. The J and all the different ones. So how does that fit into this idea about Deuteronomy?
The big divisions and the most robust divisions are between D and P. If you look at language, you look at theology, there's not a lot of disputes about which side of that divide you are on. The other 2 sources, J and E, there's more, I think people believe that they can be found, but there is always arguments about exactly where they are and what they constitute. And that makes sense if you consider the theories that J and E are the earliest sources, and therefore they are the ones that were probably corrupted the most or preserved less pristinely when everything is taken up into the Torah. There is an idea that people try to, because people like to do parallel things. If you have 4, you like to have 2 and 2. And a lot of people will look at J as the older source of Judah, which was also the source of P. So J and P are in the South, and J is the old South, and P is sort of the newer South. And they look at E and D in the same situation, that E is the early northern source, and that D is a later northern source. And I think that makes some sense. But there's a lot of reading one can do in source criticism. It's the areas that always have seemed the most obvious and discrete, the boundaries that have seemed most discrete to me in terms of language and in terms of legal and theological differences are the differences between P and D. And that the struggle is then try to fit J and E into the work somehow. And there's different degrees of confidence about how well that can be done. If you are looking for books, Who Wrote the Bible by Richard Elliott Friedman is one of the best books that's ever been written on this. Who Wrote the Bible by Richard Elliott Friedman. And he introduces not just the theory, he introduces not just the history of the theories, but he provides guidance for when you're reading the Torah. Well, how do I figure out where I am? I mean, how can I kind of guess what the source is on the basis of what I'm reading? It's a wonderful book.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you for joining me tonight. If there's no more questions, I will let everyone go, but I'll remind that we have a introduction to Judaism class next Wednesday at 8 o'clock on the station. And it'd be wonderful to see you guys there too. And until then, if I don't see you in shul, I hope everyone has a great week. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.